Waltzing Among the Willows by Aurora Schlosswald. This book is dedicated to the unexpected friends I met last summer and to the members of my first fan club. Welcome to Prairie Grass. The following story is based on a collection of newspaper articles, diary entries, documentaries, and autobiographies collected by the authoress during her time spent researching her own ancestry. While every attempt has been made to retell their stories as accurately as possible, certain names and details have been changed to protect identities. Readers should also remember that people exaggerate, omit details, or occasionally lie, so some information may have been purposely distorted or accidentally misinterpreted by modern historians. No actual photographs of the people or locations mentioned in this manuscript have been used. The images on the front and back covers are not associated with the characters, settings, or events of this novel. Wanted for being a nuisance at the movie theater. Dead people stared out from the black and white photograph in the history textbook. At least, Keith assumed they were dead. He wasn't paying enough attention to the lesson to know when the war between the states had been fought, but it seemed around a century ago, give or take a few years. And to this day, the teacher droned, people in that town who join the army must take the oath of enlistment in a public ceremony, and the new soldiers must then place their right hands on Sergeant Caleb Fredrickson's headstone and say, "I promise." If Keith had been listening, he would have heard the reason behind such an unusual ritual, for it had been carefully documented in several journals written by soldiers who were eyewitnesses during the Civil War. Despite the fact that his father was a wealthy plantation owner, Caleb Fredrickson had been an abolitionist who helped slaves escape on the Underground Railroad. When his father discovered his secret and put an end to his efforts, Caleb joined the Union forces, who had overlooked the fact that he was barely 16 years old. However, he fell ill that winter. Realizing his inevitable fate, he asked to address the other soldiers a final time. "Let me sit on a horse," he rasped. "If I sit on the ground, they won't be able to see me." One of the other men helped him onto a horse, and he looked out toward his brothers in arms, as well as a few sisters who had disguised themselves as men for the chance to fight for the Union. Many of the soldiers' faces held sorrow, but most were simply exhausted. "Do not pity me," Caleb began. "I have not lost my life. I have given it of my own free will, for I chose to be here. I am not losing my battle against this illness, for I will shortly prove victorious over all the problems of this world." His words were halted by a violent coughing fit, and he slumped forward in his saddle. After pausing to catch his breath, he sat upright once more. The men waited in silence for him to continue. "I don't know why some people die painlessly and instantly in old age, while others die of illness or injury in their youth. I simply know that we all have a day to depart this world. I had resolved to accept my fate as punishment for all the slaves I have stolen from my father, but now I see it as a mercy. Anyone who sees such glories as I have can no longer be content, for he will be satisfied with no less. Oh, my friends, do not pity me." The soldiers exchanged glances of dismay, yet they couldn't help but admire the courageous way he accepted the end of his young life. "There's nothing beautiful about enduring the horrors of war. It is a terrible sacrifice we have chosen to make, but we do not truly know what we live for until we ask ourselves what we would die for. All of you are here today because you believe in living and dying for something greater than yourselves, and I am honored to have served with such noble hearts as yours." Another round of coughing interrupted his speech, and one of the men rushed forward to help steady Caleb, lest he fall off his horse. The young man smiled gratefully. "Even now I do not desert you. If the soul can still visit this world after death, I will continue to serve with you. I will trip you and cause bullets to fly over your heads so they won't kill you where you stand. I will sit beside you around the campfire and pray that feeling my presence gives you the strength to continue. For those of you who survived the war, I will remind you of our time together, that the memories of those fallen may never be forgotten, even by future generations. And for those of you who lay down your lives, I will comfort you during your final moments and escort you to the beauty of the next world." Caleb shuddered. It took all his strength simply to draw a single breath, but he knew that for the sake of everyone who had gathered, he must be strong enough to die bravely. Others had gone before them. He must honor their memory by refusing to show cowardice. "Do not allow your hearts to grow bitter against the Confederates, for many of them are innocent men defending their homes just as we are. Promise me now that whether we win or lose the war, none of you will ever stop fighting for what is just, no matter what the price, because these are the things worth fighting for." After several moments of silence, the nearest man looked Caleb in the eye and clasped his hand firmly. "I promise." "I promise," a voice shouted from the back. The exclamation was taken up by all present. His commanding officer approached. "Godspeed, Sergeant Fredrickson." For a moment, Caleb was startled by this unexpected promotion, but he quickly regained his composure and raised his hand in a salute. Before he could lower his arm, his entire body went limp, and a group of men rushed forward to help him down from the saddle. Although he struggled for breath, a look of relief washed over Caleb's face. No doubt he had heard all his life that only in fictional stories or before public executions did people have time to speak any final words before death, let alone make entire speeches. In the real world, death overcame its victims like a cruel form of sleep, or their final words were incoherent sounds or cries of pain. How blessed he had been to have proven an exception to this reality. As his soul left his body, a soft smile crept over his lips, as if he were the only one in the world who knew a precious secret. During the war, many men reported that they owed their lives to a young man who had shielded them from enemy fire, but when they turned to thank him, he had simply vanished. To this day, visitors to the campsite where Caleb had been buried, now a National Historical Park, still reported hearing someone whistling Julia Ward Howe's famous song. Some visitors even claimed to have felt a hand lightly grip their shoulders, even though no one else was in the area, but they somehow felt comforted. Of course, many people found such stories to be completely ludicrous. What about all the other soldiers who had perished during the war? Were they not important enough to come back as ghosts to save their friends? As for modern sightings, they were most likely false. Anyone who enjoyed a good story could easily imagine it so vividly that certain parts began to feel real. The fact that this alleged ghost couldn't think of anything more original to whistle than the basic theme song of the Civil War was proof that none of this stuff was true. Keith looked at the clock on the wall, unable to believe how little time had passed. Why did teachers always talk about boring things in the distant past? Why couldn't they talk about anything interesting that had happened recently, like the moon landing? The bored student then looked back to the photograph of the soldiers in his textbook. Had people protested the Civil War like they did the conflict in modern times? Had anyone worn flowers, tie-dye shirts, or peace medallions? As soon as the final bell rang to dismiss the students, Keith approached Craig. The boys had gotten permission from their parents to watch a movie that began shortly after school, and although the cinema was only a few blocks away, the walk seemed to last for hours. Craig fidgeted impatiently as he stood in line. "This is going to be so boss! I've never seen a movie on opening day before, and this is the first showing." Keith shrugged. "I don't know. How fab can a Western be if it doesn't have any of the big stars in it? Was the studio too cheap to pay John Wayne or Clint Eastwood?" The old woman in line ahead of them accidentally moved her arm too far back as she reached for her purse, bumping Keith. "I beg your pardon, young man." He stared in disbelief. Why was someone her age in line to see a movie? Surely she wasn't going to see the new Western. Shouldn't she be knitting a sweater or baking cookies? "Next, please," the man behind the counter instructed. "One for Sarsaparilla Hill. I should have a seat reserved." She opened her purse and a few coins dropped to the floor. "Pardon me, sir. I'll just pick those up so I can pay you." Afterwards, she handed the man her driver's license. Without a word, he glanced at it before checking the paper that held the name of the person who had called to make a reservation. He then returned the license with a brief nod, and an usher escorted the woman to the best seat in the auditorium. As the boys slid into their own chairs, the elderly woman left her seat. A few minutes later, she returned with the popcorn she had forgotten to buy when she had paid for her ticket. Craig couldn't help but notice that every time the elderly woman passed someone, she begged his or her pardon rather than making a simple apology or asking to be excused. "Why do you suppose she does that?" he wondered aloud. "Probably just her age," Keith reasoned. "When we get that old, we'll probably say things like that and turn into uptight squares." The lights dimmed, and after a few previews, a stunning desert with rugged cliffs and towering saguaros graced the screen. A man in a white hat rode into town and assumed the responsibilities of sheriff. He was a burly man with a commanding presence, and his fists were always clenched. Men in the town feared the speed of his draw, and women admired his grit, albeit from a reasonable distance, for although he rarely shot ladies, he often found excuses to strike them. "I ain't gonna be sheriff too long," the lawman announced. "I just gotta find Eli Volpes." At this point in the movie, Keith and Craig were unable to concentrate, for the old woman was laughing so hard that she was sobbing into her hands. Her entire body shook, and although she bit down on her lips to silence her laughter, her change in breathing was obvious. To no one's surprise, the character Eli Volpes wore a black hat. He was greatly admired by the local saloon gal, who was a stark contrast to the rancher's daughter. The latter was frequently found praying demurely in the church. "When I kill that sorry Eli Volpes, you're gonna marry me," the sheriff announced. "If it's the will of God," the rancher's daughter replied kindly. "I ain't asking you to marry me. I'm a-telling you that you're gonna, and you ain't gonna give me no trouble." He stormed out of the church. During the scene where the stagecoach guard got drunk and accidentally shot his wife in the foot, the old woman watching the movie groaned. When a horse thief was hanged, she pulled a handkerchief from her purse and began weeping. However, her laughter returned during the scene where a team of cattle drivers managed to charm every woman in town with their ruggedly handsome appearances and natural charisma. The movie ended when the outlaw and the sheriff faced each other 40 feet apart and drew their pistols. Before the lawman had cleared leather, Eli's bullet hit him in the throat. Seeing his fallen opponent, Eli graciously tipped his hat to the townspeople, and the scene faded to black before showing the list of credits. "What kind of film ends this way?" Keith demanded incredulously. "Isn't the sheriff supposed to win and ride off into the sunset with the rancher's daughter?" "But isn't it cool? It takes place in our town," Craig pointed out. "Just imagine what life was like all those years ago. They didn't even have cars or electricity." "Our town?" Keith shook his head. "In case you haven't noticed, we're in the middle of the prairie. If it took place here, there wouldn't be all those cactuses." He frowned. "Cacti? Never mind. The movie wasn't even that good. Besides, it's not like any of this stuff actually happened." A few weeks later, the newspaper announced that Lev Dude Ranch was hosting a celebration of the town's history. Reenactors would be demonstrating traditional skills and crafts of the 19th century. Visitors would also have the opportunity to join a trail ride, send each other telegrams, round up cattle, and ride in a stagecoach. Vendors would serve traditional foods to any guest who worked up an appetite, and a group of actors would pretend to steal horses. Much to Keith's annoyance, before the day's events could begin, the ranch owner made a speech to welcome her guest. To his astonishment, he recognized her as the elderly woman from the movie theater. "Thank you all for coming," she began. "I am your hostess, so if there's anything I can do to make your stay more pleasant, be sure to let me know. I won't bore you with the details, but I want you to know that the new movie, Sarsaparilla Hill, is inaccurate. When I was much younger, this town was called Prairie Grass, and I lived here. Many of the characters from the movie are based on people I once knew. Murmurs rippled throughout the crowd. I am well over a century old. Some people may envy me for having such a long life when so many others have died young, but other people may pity me for having such a long time to feel the ailments of old age and the loneliness of having outlived those near to my heart. Everyone seeks longevity, but all things come with a price. Keith frowned. How long was this lady going to ramble? On the whole, it's been a good enough life. I've met quite a few interesting people, such as Myra Maybelle Shirley, Phoebe Ann Moses, Martha Jane Cannery, the James brothers, John Henry Holliday, John Wesley Hardin, Henry McCarty, Robert Leroy Parker, Lisbeth Borden, James Butler Hickok, Charles E. Bowles, and William Frederick Cody, among others. Many others. Not only did I meet them alive, but I saw some of their dead bodies after they'd been shot, or I stood at their graves. I even witnessed many of their executions, and I visited the survivors in prison. His interest was suddenly piqued. Had she truly known such notorious outlaws? I once outwitted Wyatt Earp, and I managed to tell Isaac Charles Parker exactly what I thought of him. But I've also had the pleasure of meeting brilliant scientists and renowned writers. I prefer to discuss the wisdom I gleaned from their knowledge of the natural world and their creative spirits. But for some reason, most people prefer hearing about the more infamous characters I've encountered. A lot of people ask me if Isaac Parker and Leroy Parker were related, but I honestly don't know. How had she met all these people? She had to have made a lot of money to travel, and she must have been very famous at one time. Now that Keith was paying closer attention, he noticed that her necklace, which was made of hemp, was a single strand of rope that ended in a noose just above her heart. She also wore metal bracelets shaped like handcuffs, one on each wrist, and her earrings were made of real bullets. Movies make me laugh, though. They try so hard to portray our daily lives, but they tend to have elements of everything but historical accuracy. We didn't have a stranger who rode into town, became the new sheriff, and saved us all from a gang of outlaws. We had a stranger who arrived in town, became the new outlaw, and utterly frustrated our poor sheriff, causing him to look rather foolish. The worst felon among us was from London, not Laredo, and the lawbreaker's name wasn't Eli, it was Ellie. The name of my ranch was inspired by her, Ellie V. As the old woman spoke, her eyes took on the gleam of distant memories. The crowd listened in silence as her spirit danced through time, a graceful waltz across the prairie, trying to form bridges over oceans.